Hi, everyone. FYI, this episode of Silvicast is being recorded virtually. It is a pandemic after all, so please excuse any funky audio issues. You know what I mean. Well, welcome to Silvicast, the podcast about all things silviculture. Our goal each episode is to bring you discussion, ideas, and information you can use as foresters and land managers. I'm Greg Edge.
And I'm Brad Hutnick.
And we are both silviculturists with Wisconsin DNR Division of Forestry and your hosts for today's show.
Hey, Greg, what was that?
Well, Brad, that's my new buzzer app. Sound pretty good, huh? See?
Maybe to you. I wouldn't call that good.
Okay, maybe it's a little rough, but hey, it's perfect for today's episode of Silvicast because today we're going to play silviculture Jeopardy, or like you like to call it, Treeperdy.
Treeperdy. All right. Well, but you got to give it to me the buzzer, because I get to be Alex Trebeck, right? It's gonna be good.
Okay. Well, that's fine. Let's
right.
Let's get on with it and play the first
good to
round.
Go? All right. You may choose from the board.
So, Alex, start easy. Give me painful acronyms for 200, please.
CMAI.
Okay, let's see. What is culmination of mean annual increment?
Very good.
So, okay, Alex, let's go a little harder here. I'm going to go down the board. Give me old world natural regeneration methods for 600, please.
Langfritstiger Blenderschlag.
Oh, what was that?
Langfritstiger Blenderschlag.
What? Let's see. Okay. Well, it's got schlag in it. So, Alex, I'm going to go with what is group selection?
No, and no, no. But it's what is a German cutting method best described as a form of irregular shelterwood.
Oh,
and
okay.
I'm glad you picked that one, Greg, because today on the show, we're going to be talking about specifically irregular shelterwoods. And I know you and I, we've talked about irregular shelterwoods a lot. We've been hearing about it more and more. And I think this is something that a lot of people are going to be interested in.
Yeah, we do hear more talk about this particular natural regeneration method, I guess. And we do see it being used or tried more in all different kinds of forest types in the US and Canada. But I would say it's sort of difficult for me to put my finger on what exactly it is. I mean, how do you define and implement a method that is, well, it's irregular?
Exactly. And so today on Silvicast, we're going to bounce this question off one of our favorite silviculture professors, Tony D'Amato from the University of Vermont.
Yay.
To see if, and we love Tony, and we're going to see if he can help us clear this up. And I know, this kind of comes too from you and I think we're really big believers in the idea that if we're going to use terms, we need to be professionals. We need to use them in the right, we need to recognize what the term means and how it's used, not only for interactions with ourselves, but maybe with foresters in the future when we're trying to do these things. So hopefully he can really help with that.
I can't wait to hear that discussion, Brad. But before we get started, today's episode of Silvicast is brought to you by Swiss Femmelschlag AD, the laxative that lets you say, hey, it's great to be irregular. Where do we come up with these?
I love it, Greg.
Hi, Tony D'Amato. How you doing?
Good to see you, Greg. Good to see you, Brad.
Welcome.
Yeah, we don't get to see you quite as often anymore. I was going to say many of our listeners, and I use the word many really loosely here, may recognize you from your days at the University of Minnesota before you left for the great Northeast. And so welcome back to the Lake States. Tell us a little bit about where you're at now and what are you doing?
Yeah, so now I'm on the other side of the northern hardwood type over in Vermont. So I'm at the University of Vermont and I'm the director of the forestry program here. But thankfully, still get chances to connect back to some great old friends in silviculture in Wisconsin. So it's good to be back with both of you today.
Yeah, we get to actually do some projects with you from time to time. So that's good that you haven't completely pulled your foot out of the Midwest. So
no.
So welcome back.
Yep. I remember one of our last in-person meetings I think we had with you, Tony. We were sitting around over a drink. I think actually you had a chili beer, or something like that. And
I knew somebody was going to bring that up.
Well, it was interesting. It was interesting. Yeah, it was a moment. But we were talking about the importance of terms. And it feels like, we're always presented with terms, and sometimes those terms are misused, or maybe people don't quite understand them. And Greg and I have had a lot of conversations about maybe just the fundamental importance of why we use terms correctly and stuff like that. And that kind of brings us to a little bit of what we're talking about today, the kind of a concept or a term, irregular shelterwood. Tony, you've worked with this for a while. What is an irregular shelterwood?
Yeah, and it's kind of it's an interesting term in many respects because as we were talking about a little bit before we started today, there's been growing interest in using irregular shelterwoods, and I think because there's varying interpretations of what it is, it's often become a catch-all for anything that doesn't look like a normal shelterwood or doesn't look like group selection or single tree selection. And so when we're talking about irregular shelterwoods, really we're getting into a multi-age shelterwood system. So we have at least 2 age classes that we're maintaining on the site. And so a portion of that overwood that we traditionally would have taken off with removal cuttings is going to be out there for 20%, at least greater than 20% of the age of the new rotation. And so really exceeding what would classify that as an even age method. But, the term irregular in kind of our lexicon is kind of a negative term in the tradition of silviculture and forestry. We use things like balanced and normal, and those often were kind of the desirable condition. And so when you see irregular come up, and I always joke with my students, it's not something we often want to be described as. And so, there's this historic use of that term as not being an uneven age method that's managing a perfectly balanced stand. You really are creating a stand that has unequal allocation of growing space to your cohorts. So as opposed to kind of the classic balanced uneven age stand that we often hold up as the model with the reverse J-shaped curve, and very much theoretical, often hard to attain out there in the landscape. But nonetheless, that's assuming that every cohort occupies a similar amount of space in that stand. Whereas with irregular, we're really allocating a disproportionate amount of growing space to typically the regenerating cohort, but nonetheless reserving some of that growing space for what we might call reserves or permanent retention, depending on how we're doing that method. And so broad brush, irregular shelterwoods really are, shelterwood technique, where we're carrying that overwood at least to create a 2 age stand. And there are some techniques, continuous cover irregular shelterwood that does have the potential that you could have 3 age classes depending on how you're using it. But like as I mentioned, I always laugh when I put up the term irregular when I'm teaching silviculture, because I'm actually talking about something that's very positive from an ecological standpoint, but often like just taking at face value might seem like it is something that isn't as ideal as another way of approaching managing stands.
So at a broad level, it is a natural regeneration method, right? So each, like a shelterwood, each entry you're trying to produce a new cohort of seedlings, and that overwood is acting as some type of a shelter to them and altering that environment for them. So that's still consistent with a regular shelterwood. It just then becomes irregular in the sense of whether you take that overwood off or how you take it off, right?
Exactly. And beyond, relying on natural regeneration that are being established under that shade, what that implies is that the source is advanced regeneration. So you are trying to build up or capitalize on advanced regeneration prior to removing that overwood, either partially or completely. And so because of that, you're working with, you can really work with a range of species, as you all know. I mean, great work on even paper birch shelterwoods. You just have to get the overwood off pretty darn quick. And so, most of our species can establish and persist for, even a year or two for our most intolerant species in shade. But But when we're doing a shelterwood, really advanced regeneration is the primary source that we're after there with that method.
So are we restricted to shade tolerant or mid tolerant species with that, or can that irregular openings be large enough that we actually get into intolerant species as well?
Yeah, I think that, a lot of the interest and the interesting thing about irregular shelterwood. So the first time I was exposed to it, I guess I was privileged, definitely, and just from an education standpoint, I had Bob Seymour as my silviculture professor, and this was in the mid to late '90s when he kind of came back with this from Germany with this Femmelschlag, really excited about. That's as far as my German goes, so I apologize for those hoping for more than that. I think it kind of means group cut is the rough translation of that. And so, there was a lot of interest, particularly in the Acadian mixed forest. So, these are systems that have, certainly hemlock, spruce and fir, but also there's species like yellow birch and paper birch and that are a bit more light demanding. And so there became, a lot of interest both in how these irregular methods, even though, again, the traditional objectives associated with them were much more economic, that aspects of them really fit nicely with our understanding, particularly of like mesoscale disturbances, these events that might not be stand replacing, they might not be gap scale or somewhat in between. And certainly Craig Lorimer's done a lot of great work on these over the years that are really important for creating that range of light environments following disturbance that will allow us to have a yellow birch or even a paper birch in a sea of tolerant species, in natural systems. And so, these irregular shelterwoods really, because you are, often creating gaps, expanding those gaps over time, you can work with a range of species and maintain those, a range from intolerant to tolerant species in the same stand. And a lot of the interest around these has been both kind of in northeastern US, but also even more so in Quebec, where they're trying to kind of emulate these disturbances that have been important for maintaining, yellow birch tends to be, and rightfully so, what a great tree, but tends to be, one of the species. How do you manage for the middle, when you have all these tolerance around?
Right.
So it sounds like, so it's not even age, right? Because we don't have that, and it's really not uneven age. It's kind of in that middle. And would you say this kind of, I see some of the interest around here is I think people see it as kind of a mismatch between what our natural processes are and what the tools we kind of have, our standard natural regeneration practices are.
Absolutely. And it's interesting, again, not to keep hammering the word irregular, but, when you look at the structure of a lot of our forests, even naturally, the rotated sigmoid and some of these curves that we often will see instead of that perfect balanced structure, many of our forests are naturally irregular, either from disturbance processes or we've created pretty irregular conditions by picking away at, value and historically, historic land use legacies. And so, there's been a lot of interest and as you all know, in the Northeast around, let's use like patch select, small patch cuts, which we call patch selection here, but really it's just group selection with, often removals that are a bit bigger than typical group selection. And the whole notion of that was, you really target, there's a pocket of old mature trees, we're going to make a patch there. And then there's a pocket of advanced regen, we're going to make a patch there. And so, responding to the stand structure as opposed to trying to impose like this, again, this BDQ or arborgas type structure on a forest that doesn't quite have it. And to be honest, it would be a challenge to sustain that. And so the irregular shelter was kind of nice in that you can embrace that irregularity where maybe, 40% of the stand needs to be regenerated, just from the perspective of risk and just potential opportunities for releasing advanced regeneration. But there's other areas that you still might want to cultivate and improve quality on, as well as retain as residual kind of structure on that site. And so it allows you to work with that template. And ironically, when we see variable density thinning and some of these kind of newer techniques that came about in response to the biodiversity concerns in the Pacific Northwest, when I look at those, that looks a lot like an irregular shelterwood to me. It is. They just use a different term. But you're creating that irregularity, and in many cases, from an ecological standpoint, creating an outstanding condition from just diversity of niches for both the species we get excited about, like trees, but also other species.
So Tony, you were recently co-authored a book, Ecological Silviculture, Foundations and Applications, with Brian Palick and others. And so what I hear you saying is this system kind of consistent with what we would frame as ecological-based silviculture? So emulating what would have been more of the natural disturbance patterns that we saw, or
Absolutely.
didn't see?
And you know, I mentioned variable density thinning. I do feel like that was a talk about terminology being misapplied. You know, thinning for regeneration. I mean, this is not but
Yeah.
so, you know, I think there were some missed opportunities even early on when it was called new forestry. As we all know, it was old forestry, but in a different package. And that much of what was being done there were irregular shelterwoods and aspects of what we might call like just an extended irregular shelterwood, you know, leaving behind some kind of scattered legacy trees, or variable density thinning, much more analogous to what, you know, what you would do with a continuous cover irregular shelterwood. And so so I think just terminology wise, if they'd stuck with maybe some of the traditional ones, it might have led to possibly even more buy-in on some of those concepts early on. But to your point, Greg, yeah, a lot of what as it led to, I guess, you know, nothing's new in silviculture. I joke this is new, like we figured it out in the 19 teens. But what's led to, I think, that this being kind of the newest method that people are excited about is it does squarely overlap with a lot of ecological objectives, because you're emulating disturbance. Retention is a big part of it. So you are leaving behind kind of large trees, and either permanently or at least for an extended period. And so there's just many elements, both compositionally and structurally, that are consistent with the outcomes that we hope for with, you know, natural disturbance-based silviculture.
Yeah. So Tony, thinking about, so foresters might be, because it's interesting, this kind of sits at that nexus between silviculture and restoration. So if people are interested in this and they're matching it up with, say, a cover type or a timber type they're working with, what should they look like in the natural disturbance regime, or what's happened in their area to inform, like, say, their implementation of irregular shelterwood?
Yeah, I mean, you know, there's really, and I mean, there's three kind of flavors of irregular shelterwood that, and Patricia Raymond in Quebec, and we've been fortunate enough, and Steve Bedard, and they're just a great group up there, and we've been fortunate enough to spend time on their lands when we could cross the border and all that good stuff. But you know, one of the references, if folks haven't read it, that we'll put up with this podcast is the outstanding review paper that they included in the Journal of Forestry on irregular shelterwoods, and really what they did was, you know, review the European literature and other literature around kind of what are the different forms and how does this fit in, and they kind of recognized three common kind of approaches to irregular shelterwood, and one I kind of view as like the vanilla irregular shelterwood, the extended irregular shelterwood, and really that might have been what people might have been taught in forestry school, you know, even when I was taught like shelterwood with reserves, you know, you do shelterwood harvest,
or reserve shelterwood, or
scatter
something.
it out there,
Mm-hmm.
not much planned for that retention other than it's a structural element that could be harvested in the future, but more likely serving other values. And then the other two is where the things get interesting, and I think you start having the opportunity to pair up with natural disturbance regimes. And so the one that gets the most attention, and partly because Bob Seymour, that was the approach that he took, was the expanding gap irregular shelterwood. He branded his own local version of that, the Acadian Fammelschlag. And so with that one, you know, basically, you know, similar to a group shelterwood, where you're really targeting existing advanced regeneration, and then creating gaps there, and then progressively expanding those gaps over time. You know, that approach really kind of will create almost these waves of regeneration because you're progressively peeling that stand back. But one thing that I think is important about that is you can retain trees in those gaps. And this is where I think the flexibility comes in, that, as we all know, once we put a tree in that gap, all of a sudden, you know, the light we thought we were creating is much less. And so, you know, being able to expand that and factor in that retention can really provide some flexibility where you can, you know, retain a yellow birch in the middle of that gap, but also, you know, make that gap effectively, you know, 3/4 of an acre in size to meet the light requirements that it needs, and so forth.
And those gaps, Tony, they don't have to be like a balanced or regulated group selection, right? They can be quite variable depending on what kind of regeneration you have, or
exactly
what structure you want.
And that's you're reading the site to some degree to really inform that placement. And That's not to say that you couldn't initiate, because it is a shelter, you initiate, regeneration in some places too, but trying to at least work with, some of what's out there. And again, it can be informed too by like, these are high risk, or these trees are, we want to make sure we're capitalizing on this group of mature trees here. And so instead of focusing in on those spots on advanced regen, it's like, this is a place where we want to make sure we're getting, harvesting done before we lose some of those trees. So it can work both ways on that front. And then the other one is a continuous cover, regular shelterwood. And that one really, looks a lot like kind of a combination of single tree and group selection happening in the same stand, but the same, to your point, Greg, oftentimes, maybe 30% of the stand is being put into groups. The remaining matrix is being thinned and improved. And then over time, you're kind of either progressively opening those groups into those matrix areas or creating kind of new groups elsewhere. But the continuous cover piece is that there's always overwood present in your regenerating areas. And so you kind of have this intermingling of cohorts, whereas with the expanding gap, you can actually, because you're kind of, again, progressively opening gaps, there's often more of like a juxtaposition, like cohorts next to each other versus across the site. And so the reason that for that long-winded explanation of that paper, one of the biggest take-homes I got from that paper, when I look at, they have a really nice table in there, really nice for the eyes of a silviculture instructor. So who knows, that is really cool. is they have all the different names for these different approaches. Swiss, Swiss Fammelschlag and Baden Fammelschlag, and really I think the biggest take-home from that to me, beyond just learning more about the technique, was that these systems really were developed with a specific forest type and a specific set of ecological conditions in mind, and it's always, fun for us, because I know we all get excited about northern hardwoods, to think about like how much we tried to, even arborgast, people use arborgast out here, arborgast was developed for, Michigan hardwoods, and so it's just
right.
And so the U.S. approach has always been, let's find the one silver bullet silvicultural technique that works everywhere, and with the regular shelterwoods in particular, you can really see like these are being designed specifically for mixed species stands in that location. So trying to kind of manage that range of tolerances, but also trying to kind of manage for the range of objectives that folks might have in that landscape. So it's kind of a nice way to kind of match it with the ecology of the system you're working with. And so ecologically, we know that gaps expand over time. Once you get one, pocket in the forest, things will coalesce. And so you can kind of emulate that with wind or disease. And even with like fire, frequent fire systems, kind of that mosaic of woodland-like structures that, would give you that variable cover across the site would be very consistent with, aspects of this as well. So that's,
so it's kind of that blending of what your objectives are, but also the silvics of the species that you're dealing with.
Absolutely.
And I always kind of get a little confused by the continuous cover one, but I think what you said makes sense to me, that it's sort of more of that blended approach.
Yep. And
if you want to look at it in traditional terms with a blending of single tree and group, but you're kind of reacting to what's in the stand.
And I think, Tony, maybe even like Robert Seymour, I've read his stuff where I've always been confused by that too, but I think he called it irregular group shelterwood with reserves, and kind of worked through that. And that kind of felt like, then I kind of semi-understood it, but it was still, I think it's one of those things until you see it or until you read about it, it's kind of ambiguous.
And his key modification to, if you were to look at like the classic definition of an expanding gap, there really wasn't within gap retention, and so, one of the main objectives of the work they were doing was trying to emulate natural disturbances in that region, which we know there'd be a surviving tree or a few within a gap. And so there, again, there's a trade-off with light that you just need to, make that gap larger or open that gap more rapidly.
And it's kind of exciting to think about, like, so the Europeans did the place-based silviculture. They kind of had the names. And so Robert Seymour had Acadian Femmelschlag, which kind of brought that down. Have you seen, so as we start to think about this, as we start to experiment with it, are there things people should keep in mind when they go to implement something like this? Like, I can imagine this is, if they've done other systems, this is going to be slightly different.
Yeah, I think, not to ignore some of the key things that are important with any multi-age technique, where if you're retaining trees and you're relying on multiple entries, that you need to have the acceptable growing stock to carry the subsequent entries. And so Steve Bedard, he works more in northern hardwoods, but with Patricia Raymond, but Patricia is much more in the really cool forest types, more like yellow birch, red spruce, kind of mixed wood forest. And so the work Steve's done, they've shown, I mean, you really need to be, 40% acceptable growing stock in the stand to make these, carry multiple entries. And if not, then you might be best off with the kind of the vanilla extended irregular shelterwood. But if you want to do continuous cover or expanding gap, having that value, because you're not doing, you're doing sometimes heavy partial removals, but it's not, obviously economically similar to what we would, a clear cutting based or even a traditional shelterwood where a lot of that volume is coming off in a single entry. And so, that's one of the keys is just thinking a little bit about the value in that stand and the ability to carry that. And then, to your point, one of the challenges when we emulate natural disturbances is we ignore the soil part of it and we get excited about, like, we've created the same amount of canopy disturbance as a wind event, but then we harvested on, 4 feet of snow. And so, it's really not doing that. And particularly, knowing your landscape where you have that, abundance in many cases of sugar maple or hopefully not Penn sedge, creating some issues. And so really making sure that you're just like with a traditional shelterwood, during that establishment cutting phase is your opportunity to really get in there and create those seedbed conditions and work with the site and trying to do that in concert. But I think there's a lot of, the nice thing is, the reason why we've seen shelterwoods fail in the past is that people, leave a little bit too much overwood. They don't get back out there soon enough. And all of a sudden there's a lot more hemlock than white pine, as an example. But with this, you're not kind of fixed to that just one entry to get back in there and release those trees. And so you can kind of progressively nudge along the silvics of multiple species, and even yellow birch, we can tolerate a bit of shade, but once advanced can really start, accelerating above some of those other species. And so being able to work with those pockets over time versus just like, with a traditional approach, if you got it, you got it. And then if not, then you're kind of, it's a lost opportunity on those sites.
I really appreciate that comment about consideration for acceptable growing stock within the stand and some of these other considerations, because I guess that's what I see as one challenge of this is how do we avoid maybe abuse of a system like this where it could slip into just an excuse to high grade a stand versus creating an irregular structure.
And that's been the challenge, to be honest. Our current use program in the state of Vermont, we use the silviculture guide that Bill League authored is kind of the, if you're doing northern hardwood management, it needs to be based upon these recommendations. Well, of course, the regular shelterwood, hasn't been really, we don't have very good long-term data like we do for single tree and group and other approaches. And so what they've had to do is provide like a little bit of detail, like what is an irregular shelterwood and what does it look like? Because to your point, Greg, I feel like it's become a bit of a catch-all, like, I just did regular shelterwood. It's like, well, I don't know, you kind of like grab some trees there, didn't here, and maybe it's a regular shelterwood, but it doesn't seem like that was the intent. So I do think there is a risk there with misapplication.
And I think it kind of comes down to, like you said, the long-term goals of keeping acceptable growing stock and developing that within the stand. So there are all these other considerations, as well as in the openings where you're trying to get regeneration and seed bed and those issues. It isn't about let's grab some trees here and grab some trees there and call it irregular.
Yeah. In some ways, though, it is reacting to what you're seeing. So imagine a marking guide for this must be kind of based on like an understanding almost of what you're trying to do as opposed to like, here are specifics for what I want to see in your marking.
Yeah. And depending on how you want to go with it, if you did go the full natural disturbance emulation route, there is an area-based, aspect to it, because both with the continuous cover and with the, expanding gap or regular shelterwood, both are using gaps as kind of a focal point. And again, gaps, I would argue, with trees in them, so gaps with retention, if that works with your objectives. And so because of that, if you want to emulate a downburst, in northern Wisconsin, maybe 30 to 40% of the stand in that entry is going into gaps of various sizes, or, similarly with the expanding irregular, what some folks have said, well, we know we get an annual or a decadal disturbance rate of 10 to 15% of the canopy. So I'm progressively opening up those gaps at that every entry, at that rate. And so I think I mean, I know that's a bit artificial just to say we're just going to emulate natural disturbances, but it gives you at least some kind of benchmarks as to, what might make sense for the total area that's being regenerated with those initial entries. And then the beauty of it is you're kind of responding to that response, because of course with a gap, we're going to get side light into the adjacent areas. You can actually, especially with the continuous cover, they'll actually treat the areas around those gaps. You're almost initiating, additional regeneration in other parts of the stand, but in a much more uniform way. And so you can then respond to those areas in the next entry. Do I now have a pocket of regeneration I want to work with? That's our next gap. Or am I seeing along the edge of this gap, which is kind of the intent, that side light giving me that shelterwood effect around the edges that I now want to release that, in subsequent entries. But I think the marking is definitely, there's not really a template for that. But I think as I'm describing it, I'm sure your brains are all going to, well, the operations sound like a nightmare too. And so, making sure that, if you're going to be expanding gaps and, and kind of even the traditional approach to this was, you want to like regenerate the areas that you're never going to drive through again, and so understanding kind of the limit of how far you want to go into that stand and recruit. And then when you're working off of that, always felling kind of away from that regeneration and working outward as a way to protect that. And so it does take a little bit of harvest planning. That would be a bit different than certainly a traditional shelter would, but to be honest, maybe a little bit more straightforward than single tree selection. So, but it's definitely would take some time to get your operators comfortable with it.
I know to your point, Brad, we have written prescriptions along this line where we've given those broad parameters or sideboards like Tony's talking about, percent of area in openings, some of the reserve trees within those opening specifications. So I think, you could specify those within a marking guide and still then leave that flexibility for the marker to respond to what they're seeing in the stand.
I think that's right. I think probably a lot of the time we're going out, we're seeing the need to become outside of what we're trying to do for the regular part, but oftentimes it's, can you do that or should you embrace it? And so I suppose the one good thing is that from an ecological perspective, we're going to have that emulation of the natural disturbance regime. As a landowner, though, we might have to be prepared for irregular flows of income coming out of that stand over time.
Yep, and that's where the other element of the irregularity comes in is, you don't have this sustained flow of yield like you would from, traditional balanced uneven age management with a regular cutting cycle and so forth.
Do these stands that are using irregular shelterwood, would they need maybe more careful monitoring? And by that, I mean, like when we set up a shelterwood, for example, we call it a process and not an event, because we're watching the regeneration, we're monitoring it, we're seeing where it's at, and then making decisions then on further management. And I could see this happening in irregular shelterwoods too, of if you're trying to prescribe future entries, you're really in this maybe a process of monitoring that, seeing how the stand is reacting, and then going from there.
No, I think it's a great way of putting it. And I think the strength of both the shelterwood, as a kind of a traditional shelterwood and irregular, is that you are imposing some leverage over process by influencing shade, but then you're also leaving options by having that overwood out there. So, you're getting constant seed rain, from those species. And so those processes are going to generate sometimes not fully predictable outcomes in terms of like, wow, and all of a sudden 5 years from now, we're starting to see the species come, showing up. And in the work that Bob Seymour did, it was, the white pine, they left a lot of white pine behind as reserves, and it took a while for that to show up in some places, but now it's pretty prominent in some of those stands, and so and they've responded to it actually both with some tending treatments to kind of advance it a bit along, as well as certainly opening up preferentially to favor that. So I think it's the same mindset that you are monitoring it and reacting to it, and trying to have some flexibility and when you can remove to try to keep some of those species competitive that might be a bit less tolerant in those stands.
Thinking about foresters who haven't worked with this, but are kind of listening to this and maybe wrestling with the idea and saying, hey, maybe I should try this. Or so maybe it sounds like it's really flexible. We could use this in a lot of different places. Are there places you wouldn't use it? Or cover types or situations where maybe people should just back away and say, no, this isn't the right tool for you?
I mean, it's not a panacea, but I do think it applies to a lot of scenarios. I mean, it can be harder, when, as I mentioned, when you do get to a point where you just don't have a lot of acceptable growing stock, where it may make sense to regenerate a much larger proportion of the stand. Again, trying to retain some of that unacceptable economically, but highly acceptable ecologically residual material. And so I think in that case, just from an economics and operations standpoint, I mean, it's not single tree selection, but it's you still need to be able to carry future entries that are not going to be of the volume that somebody might have with an even age method. So that'd be one scenario. And then I think also, I did mention variable density thinning, and that's often thought of in like plantations, going in and trying to create heterogeneity in a very homogeneous construct. And so I think in there, just bearing in mind that, that whole notion of trying to get advanced regeneration of desirable species, that process might not be there as effectively. And so in those cases, you might actually have to plant or do things to kind of, recruit the species that you're interested in kind of, diversifying that stand with. But it does, lend itself to a lot of our forest types, just thinking of our disturbance regime, again, not to hail his work, but I do what I do because of Craig Larmer's work. It was a real huge influence on me for a long time. And you look at our forests, and it's just frequent small scale, and every 300 to 400 years, there's like a mesoscale event, and it creates this really, naturally irregular condition. And so, across many forests, and that includes in our, kind of our mixed pine systems where there's a lot more variability in those disturbance regimes as well. I mean, maybe our barrens might not be perfectly suitable for, but most of the forest types, it's quite consistent with our understanding of the ecology of those forests and in the range of mixed species that can coexist in those stands.
We recently did a show on degraded stands, and it kind of reminds me of some of the rehabilitation treatments that would be employed in those look almost like the irregular shelterwood system in a way.
Absolutely. And I think that's why some have been, and with good intent, excited about this as an alternative to what's always, it's a northern hardwood stand, you have to manage it with, uneven age management. Well, I can't, because it's, in a terrible shape. Or
Right.
I want to be able to, in our sites, with beech being a real challenge here, pushing it more towards yellow birch on those sites where it's not a good maple site, that, this type of system allows that a bit more effectively than maybe the traditional uneven aged approaches would. So there has been a lot of interest around that, as well as a way to just convert to a more uneven age structure, just not balanced. You can over time kind of shift a more homogeneous stand into a much more complex stand with this approach.
Mm-hmm. So, that sounds like actually, so it fits the idea of restoration. And I've heard you say in the past, I like this, it was the concept of, we're always going to have new objectives and new goals in forestry, but we're going to have the same old tools. Yep. So essentially just make sure you can fit your tools to that. So it feels like one of those things we might not have thought about was climate change. So this feels like maybe it's setting us up for that diversity of things happening within a stand from a climate change perspective.
No, I think you're right. And yeah, I definitely, we keep repackaging, I mean, I joke with my students, there's a reason my office isn't in the medical school, they've got the silviculture, we might have a new thing every century or so, but yeah, it's really just, we have new objectives and similar tools. And with the climate change element, the mesoscale disturbance, when we look at, drought tolerance and when we look at just, diversity of species, if all we did was single tree selection and small group selection, we kind of know what we're going to get, in terms of composition. And that's not functionally a good scenario from vulnerability to climate change. But all of a sudden you start doing irregular shelterwood, which could still carry, you can still have sugar maple in those forests and hemlock in those forests, but now you're creating recruitment windows for, yellow birch, depending on the site, red oak, as well as a range of intolerant tree species. And so even just the ability to create that diversity of composition and diversity of structures, even ironically, some of the early use of this approach was in response to like avalanches and things in Switzerland, kind of creating these waves in different heights of the canopy as a way to minimize vulnerability to that. And so there's a lot of things that we talk about from an adaptation standpoint that are very consistent with this. And even the work we've done with irregular shelterwoods, we've been using the continuous cover approach but creating larger openings, and that's where we're planting. Kind of those are the places where we know there's enough light for a red oak or bitternut hickory to grow, as opposed to the other areas. We're still working with the existing stand and thinning the stand and treating the matrix like you would, for other objectives. So I think it fits really nicely with global change adaptation type objectives, and actually even the Minnesota Adaptive Silviculture for Climate Change site in Red Pine. It's it's an expanding gap, irregular shelterwood, when they're kind of transitioning that forest as well. So there's a lot of compatibility with it, and even the Foresters for the Bird program. One of the main prescriptions is irregular shelterwood, and part of that is because you're creating that. You have some really good hiding cover with a kind of young regenerating stand, but a mix of mature structure with that, and just really blending kind of that range of niches that these interior bird species respond to.
Tony, kind of circling back to where Brad started, and we like you said, we always talk about, Brad and I, about terminology, and that's because as foresters, a lot of times we have to put these ideas down in writing in a prescription that we hand off to somebody else, and they may not implement it for years until later. And so we're always trying to be as clear as we can about what we're trying to prescribe. And I think this has really helped me, I know, just kind of think about this a little bit more. I don't know. I always want to be structured. So I like Patricia's article because it helps me kind of structure it in my head. But this conversation has helped me kind of get my arms around it a little bit better and think about how I might put that into prescriptions more clearly. So I appreciate that.
No, and I think reflecting on the cultural influences on all of us, from a silviculture perspective, the people the textbooks that we've read and continue to read, and the approaches that have been advocated for centuries, and then in the U.S. for decades, and in kind of the forest types we work in. This was not really one of the methods that was brought over, and popularized. And so I think in some cases too, it's a culture shift on our own part to get comfortable with something other than, perfect uneven age management and a hardwood site. And so I think in many cases that's unfortunately a challenge because we don't have the body of literature and experience with it. But I similar to those other approaches, you kind of locally vetting it and getting a better handle on, what does work from both the civics of the forest you're working with, but also those objectives is really important. And so it's daunting, but it's also exciting in that, we got something a little bit different to work with now. And part of that is just because for some reason, we wanted these perfect, balanced and, all the things, all those positive adjectives, silviculture early on. And so, Dave Smith and those folks, it's interesting. There was a Northern Hardwood workshop in the mid 80s, and he said, these irregular forests, maybe the best approach is this method called irregular shelterwoods. It's like, well, finally, after, 6 editions of that textbook, you're going to acknowledge this thing. But, so anyway, I think there's a lot to be learned. And
so, Greg, I think people are going to actually be, and I think about it from my context too. I think people are going to be really excited about this because as a forester, how many times do you get to look at a new regeneration system? I mean, that's kind of the cool part. You get to try something different. You get to actually see if it works. So I think this is good. And I think this is going to be, hopefully this is a launching point for a lot of people trying to think about, maybe I should try this.
Really good discussion. And I appreciate your insights, Tony, as always. So we definitely have more to talk about here, but we'll just probably have to call it good for now.
Yeah.
So
until we find another chili beer.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, there's always those conversations.
Yeah,
that's right.
Mistake I'll never live down,
That wasn't a mistake.
No.
It was like, I finally found a beer that I just couldn't stomach drinking.
Well, thanks, Tony.
Yep. Yeah, great seeing both of you connecting.
Yep. Take care.
That music can only mean it's time for the Dropbox. The Dropbox is a regular segment where we take your comments, questions, tips, etc., and share them with our listeners.
Hey, Brad, from time to time, we get a little philosophical about silviculture, right?
A lot philosophical.
Okay, well, this is really good to know and reassuring. Well, we're not the only ones. After listening to the Silvicast episode on degraded stands with Tom Hill, Listener Stephen from Houghton writes, he's reminded of a Leo Tolstoy quote, "Healthy forests are alike. Every degraded stand is unhappy in its own way." I kind of like that.
Yeah, but wait, Leo Tolstoy said that?
Well, I don't think he said exactly that. I think Stephen was maybe paraphrasing. Maybe that's not the right word, but you know what I mean.
Yeah, I mean, first, kudos to Stephen for actually listening to this podcast and reading Anna Karenina, because that puts him in like the most unique demographic probably on the planet. But hey,
True.
for the rest, yeah, but for the rest of our listeners, then this kind of ups the whole thing. So you got to put down the Harlequin, put down the Harlequin romances and start bucking up and getting the Tolstoy out.
Yeah, that's right. You know who we're talking to out there, by the way.
Yeah, that's right. Doug, we're talking to you. Thanks for listening to today's episode of Silvicast. All good things must come to an end.
Yeah, Brad. But what does that have to do with this show?
Thank you, Statler or Waldorf, whichever you choose to associate with.
I don't know who I am there.
Yeah. If you have any ideas for future episodes or a question for the Dropbox, please let us know. You can reach us at UW Stevens Point's Wisconsin Forestry Center by emailing wfc@uwsp.edu. Feel free to include a sound file of your question or your comment if you like. We learn best when we wrestle with questions, so keep them coming.
All right. Thanks, Brad. And take care, everybody. And always, I want to send out a big thank you to our team, because we couldn't do it without you. Thanks, Haley Frater, our editor-in-chief at the Wisconsin Forestry Center, Noah LeMade, who's our IT master and makes it all happen behind the scenes, and our theme music by Paul Frater. And a special thanks to UW Stevens Point's Wisconsin Forestry Center. Take care.
Take care.